Hi everybody, very welcome to Mentour and yet another video podcast. As always, I hope you're doing absolutely fantastic. Today on the video, guys, I'm going to be talking about summer, but not the kind of laying in your hammock, chilling, having a good time type of summer. No, I'll be talking about the problems that comes with flying an aircraft during the summer. I'll give you 5 different reasons why it can be very challenging. So stay tuned.
Wind 31016, everyone right, everyone right. Third land, 31 right. Delta 216.
This video is brought to you by our long-term sponsor, Brilliant.org. Now, if you've been like me, chilling in the hammock, kind of going out swimming a little bit, not really engaging your brain much for the last few weeks, well then, I highly recommend that you go in and check out Brilliant.org. They will give you things like daily challenges, which will engage your brain in a fun and interactive way. And they will give you ways to solve the problems if you find that they're too hard. 500 first of you will get a whopping 20% off the annual fee of Brilliant. So go in, check it out. It's completely free to check it out. Right guys, so flying during the summer is not all happiness, joy and good weather. It's actually quite challenging from a number of reasons. And I'm going to give you 5 different reasons now, of which I think you haven't thought of quite a few of them. So, number 1, air conditioning. All right. I don't know if you've ever noticed that sometimes when you get on board an aircraft now during the summer and it's warm and hot outside, it can be really stuffy inside of the aircraft. And you'll ask yourself, well, why don't they just switch on the air conditioning? Why do they leave it like this? Now, the fact is that in quite a few of the major airports that we fly into, we are not allowed to use our auxiliary power unit, the APU, more than a few minutes after we're blocked on and a few minutes before we're about to push back. Okay. The reason for that is that the APU is actually a jet engine that uses between 40 and 50 kilos of fuel every hour. And if you look at the big airport, if everyone would be running their APU, it would be terrible to breathe at that airport, right? The air quality would become very, very bad very, very quickly. So they put these kind of restrictions in force. And if you fly to a country like Spain, Greece, Italy, around the Mediterranean, they're used to this. So they have preconditioned air. You will see these kind of big yellow or orange funnels that's connected to the lower part of the aircraft, which provides us with the preconditioned air. So in those places, this is not a problem. The problem becomes when that system is not in force and you are experiencing high temperatures in northern parts of Europe where they're not kind of prepared for this, or if you're at a smaller airport, this system is not there and the APU is not working. Because sometimes when we're using the APU a lot, like we are during the summer, sometimes there are small faults that develops in the APU, and we might have to actually transfer the aircraft to a maintenance station, as in a main maintenance center, to get that APU fixed. Until that happens, the APU will not work. And that's fine. It works perfectly. It's perfectly safe to fly an aircraft without an APU. You just need to have an external ground starter in order to start the engines. But if it's hot outside, this becomes a major problem. Because sometimes, which we'll get to later on, sometimes you get very long delays during the summer, for one reason or another. And when you have those delays, if you don't have any external air conditioning and the passengers are boarded on the aircraft, the temperature will be high, but not only that, the humidity will be high. Because 189 passengers who are sitting inside of a tube breathing will produce a lot of moisture. And it's the combination of high moisture content and a high temperature that makes it almost unbearable to be inside. Okay? This is why when I have found myself in situations like this, first of all, I have tried to delay the boarding as much as possible. But sometimes that's not possible either, because if you have ATC slot restrictions, let's say that you have a 2-hour slot restriction, we need to board the passengers, get everything ready and send out a ready message to air traffic control, because if we do that, the slot time might actually be reduced significantly. So instead of waiting 2 hours, we might only have to wait 15 minutes. The problem here is that you don't know if that's going to work or not. When you have all of these passengers on board and the temperature is starting to rise, first of all, we try to keep the doors open. We try to get air flowing through the cabin, both the forward and the back doors being guarded by our flight attendants. Make sure that we get as much current as possible. Maybe lower the sun shades, the window shades on the sunny side of the aircraft, but none of that will actually work. If the APU is not working, the temperature inside of the cabin is going to get extremely hot very quickly. And I've actually been in a situation where I've asked air traffic control to start up one engine on stand and use that as an air conditioning unit while we're waiting for the slot. Now, obviously, you need to calculate fuel for that, making sure that you have enough fuel and that you don't develop an imbalance in the fuel tanks. But it can be done. And this is in extreme circumstances. Because what we've seen examples of is people not doing this, not having AC connected to the aircraft, not having a working APU, closing up the doors and waiting. And it only takes about 10-15 minutes before people start to panic inside of the aircraft. And we've even seen passengers opening the main doors, extending the slides because the slides come out automatically and just jump out because it becomes that bad that quickly. So as a pilot, you have to be very, very conscious of this, making sure that you don't, that you don't subject your passengers and crew to a situation like this. So the second thing, performance. So when the temperature starts rising outside, you have to understand that the aircraft will fly using air over the wings and air through the engines. As the temperature starts rising, the density of the air will decrease, which means that essentially it's less air. And that means that not only will the wings not be as effective, as in you would probably need longer runway, the engines that are essentially accelerating air through the engines, pushing it back in order to create the thrust that we need, will also be less effective. So what we do is we make sure before the departure that we're using the current temperature. This is very, very important, especially in the morning when the temperature starts to rise quickly, that we have the most current and up-to-date temperature in our performance calculations. And then we put that in. And in the case of the 737, there are not really any flight manual restriction when it comes to maximum temperature. But what we have though, what I've noticed myself, is that if you start to try to calculate the temperature above 53 degrees centigrade, then the calculation doesn't work. Our operational performance tool doesn't accept temperatures above 53, so we can't fly with that. But up until then, the only real restriction is, do we have enough runway to take off? This is why if you see airports that are in countries where the temperatures tend to rise a lot, they tend to be much longer, right? Because you need longer runways. And especially if you're taking off from an airport where the temperature is both high and you're at a very high pressure altitude. Because if you have a combination of those two things works together in order to make it much harder to take off, basically. But don't worry, we will have calculated this, and if there's not enough runway, we will not take off. Right, so number 3 then, slot times, delays. So during the summer is when most people tend to have their vacation. That's when people want to go out and travel. They want to see the world, they want to go to different city breaks, things like that. This means that in the summer, you will have a much, much higher traffic volume than you will have during the winter. And what this means is that the skies, the airways that we're using, are much more densely populated. So this will cause slot times. It means because we have to make sure that we always have a separation between the aircraft en route, we won't be able to let all of them up during the times that they want to fly. The air traffic control needs to kind of even it out, and sometimes you have a very high volume of traffic into a specific airport. Well, in that case, the aircraft that are about to fly in there is going to be held back in order to make sure that everyone can come in and land when they want to. So this is why during the summer you will hear more and more about air traffic control delays. And what this means is that the aircraft that was supposed to depart maybe at 8 o'clock in the morning might have a slot time at 10 o'clock instead. And like I was saying in the beginning of the video, what we do is we see that slot time. We always board the passengers on time anyway, unless there is a specific reason for the slot. If the airport has been closed for whatever reason, the airport that we're going to, well, then we might not board the passengers. But if it is because of capacity, we board the passengers, we send out a ready message to air traffic control, and then we wait. And hopefully air traffic control can find a little opening, a little gap, and they can let us go earlier. So this is why I get a lot of questions about this. Well, why don't you just leave the passengers in the terminal? It's much nicer to be sitting there instead of sitting in a stuffy aircraft. This is the reason for that, guys. Also, on top of that, we have things like air traffic control strikes. They tend to happen mainly during the summer because that's when they have the highest impact. That's when an air traffic controller can make their points with striking. And those things can cause severe delays. All of this combined means that during the summer is when we have by far the most delays. And most of the time it has nothing to do with the airline that you're flying with, and you have to remember that the cabin crew, that's, the kind of interface, the ones that you meet, the face of the airline, can do absolutely nothing about the air traffic control restrictions. The only ones that can do something about that is the pilots to a certain extent by pushing air traffic control, but mostly it is just air traffic control that has this. Right? If there's a huge delay for whatever reason, we can ask our operations unit to see if there's any way to refile the flight plan past an area which has congested airspace. But that normally comes with us having to refuel the aircraft and other complications as well. So what we do is what I mentioned before. We board you, even if we know that there's a slot delay. We send in a ready message, we keep updating, and from a pilot perspective, the most important thing to do during that ground delay is to make sure that you, the passengers, are well informed of what was going on, which is why every 20 minutes of such a delay, I come in and I make a PA and I tell the passengers, even if there's nothing new, I will tell them that there's nothing new to make sure that they're constantly in the loop. Okay, the third thing is weather, right? So in a high pressure environment, when we're flying in and there's almost no clouds around, it's beautiful sunny weather, then the weather is not such a big deal. However, we do get quite a lot of convective activity anyway. Convective activity is basically where you have pockets of air being basically released from the ground and climbing because they're hotter than the surrounding air. So that happens regularly. It starts in the beginning of the spring when the sun starts heating up the surface, and it goes throughout the summer. That can cause quite a bit of turbulence on final. And when I'm doing line training, when we're flying into places like Girona, which is my home base, it can make the approach quite tricky because it's like flying to a certain extent like a sailplane, like a glider. And you come in on final, suddenly you hit one of these air pockets that pushes the aircraft up. Now, of course, if you do that, you need to pitch forward and you need to take off a bit of thrust because it's basically energy being transferred into the aircraft. But as you get out of that air pocket, then you're going to have to be fairly quick with adding on thrust and pitching up. Otherwise, you will be coming below the glide slope and you will be constantly having to do these kind of corrections all the way down from normally about 3,000 feet and down. It is something that I find quite fun. It's quite challenging and quite fun to fly like that. It is really challenging if you're doing your training because you have to basically feel the aircraft starting to move up. You'll see and feel that before the instrumentation starts showing it. So it's a lot about experience with the aircraft. Now, if the convective activity becomes, is in a type of air mass that is unstable, it means that pocket of air that we were talking about might just continue to rise. And those pockets of air tend to be full of water vapor. So it's full of potential cloud. It keeps climbing until it reaches what we call the dew point, which is where the water vapor starts to condensate into water droplets, and it forms these beautiful cumulus summer clouds that you're used to. Now, if the atmosphere is really unstable, the air will continue to climb. There will still be more heat inside of that cloud than it is in the surrounding air. It will continue to climb, and it will go from these nice fluffy summer clouds to towering cumulus. That's when you see them starting to be a bit dark at the bottom and a little bit higher. The column is a bit higher. And then they will turn into cumulonimbus, CB clouds, which are the storm clouds, the ones that create hail, severe downdrafts, heavy rain, thunder, lightning. When that happens, they become a threat to us. So the meteorological services tends to be very good at forecasting when these are going to arrive. We tend to take a lot of extra fuel when that happens. The good thing with these clouds is that they tend to be fairly very small in geographical kind of outreach. So they will be there over the airport, and then they will quickly move. So in about 20 minutes, generally, a CB would have gone away and would have opened up for us to come in, unless there's a lot of them. But with the risk of CBs, because we never fly into one of those, that's where you get wind shears, that's where you get severe turbulence, things like that. So we avoid them using our weather radar. But there's an extra threat with this as well, and that is once the CB has moved away from the airport, you know how much rain can come out of one of those? Well, that rain stays to a certain extent on the runway. So what we've seen is that if we're not careful, these CBs can cause flooded runways, and as we come down and land, if we haven't given it enough time to let the water dissipate, you might land and you might get aquaplaning, so you don't get as much braking as you were intending, you might run off the end of the runway. So it's very important that once the CB has cleared, we either give it a few minutes to let the water dissipate, or we ask air traffic control to send out a vehicle to check the runway surface to make sure that there's not a lot of water standing on top of the runway and could cause aquaplaning when we land. So that's very, very important. So as you can see, a lot of things to think about. Now, the last thing that I want to mention is brake cooling. So the brakes of an aircraft works very much like the brakes on your car. We have disc brakes, many of them connected to each wheel. And when we land, we apply the brakes. We're coming in at maybe 300 kilometers per hour. We weigh around 62 tons or something like that. There's an enormous amount of energy that's being transferred from the aircraft onto the brakes. Now, that energy will basically turn into heat. The brake discs will become extremely hot. And we have to calculate how long we need to stand on the stand with the parking brakes released in order to make sure that there's enough air flowing past the brake discs to cool them down so that they're safe when we have to take off again. So what we do is we actually go into our old-fashioned performance manual. We check the outside temperature, we check the weight of the aircraft, we check the speed at which we start applying the brakes. That is then transferred onto brake energy, and then we go into separate performance page, and we check whether or not we are using reverse thrust or idle reverse thrust, which we might do on the last flight of the day, for example, what type of brakes we have, so if they're steel brakes or if they're carbon brakes. And from that, when we've gone through all of these different pages, we will end up with a time which says this is how much time you need to sit on the ground. And this is why we are always using reverses if we're doing a quick turnaround. Because as I've been mentioning before, the reverses on a dry runway might not affect the braking distance that much, but what they will do is they will take away quite a lot of energy from the brakes and enable us to do a quick turnaround because of the lower temperature of the brakes. So this is something that we have to do, especially at higher temperatures, and it's something that you might not have thought about before. Now, we're not only creating brake energy when we are braking off the landing or doing a rejected takeoff. We're doing so as we're taxiing as well, because you're constantly kind of braking the aircraft down, maybe for a turn or things like that. So we also have to calculate how long of a taxi distance do we have, because that also increases the amount of cooling time that we will need once we reach the gate. So that's it, guys. As you can see, there's still quite a lot of physics involved in, you know, thinking about things like temperature, about performance figures, the air density, the pressure altitude, the, you know, how much energy is being transferred into the brakes. And this is why I am so happy that this video is brought to you together with Brilliant.org, because what Brilliant.org does is they will keep you sharp when it comes to these concepts. When it comes to mathematics and physics, they will do so in a fun and interactive way. And especially if you're just like me, been just chilling for the last couple of weeks in the hammock, well then use the daily challenges that they send out and just do, you know, 10-15 minutes a day of actually thinking about physics and maths. You will be really surprised how much that helps you keep yourself sharp for when the school starts or when it's time for your ATPL theory. Remember that the 501st of you who uses this link here below will get 20% off the annual fee of Brilliant, but it's completely free to check it out, so do that. Also guys, before you go, I want you to go and check out mentorpilot.com. It has been completely redone. It's now much faster. It's much sleeker, better looking. We have forums in there now that you can discuss, which will eventually be connected to the Mentor Aviation app, but not now. The website has been redone by a company called Dragonscale, which had done a fantastic job with the remake of the website. I will link to Dragonscale as well here in the description of the video, so if you need to change your website and you need professionals to do it, check them out. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.